You think a minimum wage job defines a man? Then you clearly don't know who you're laughing at. Olivia Carter's voice cut through the small dinner table like it owned the air itself, and for a moment the room went quiet before her friends burst into laughter again. All of them looking at me like I was the punchline of a joke I hadn't agreed to be part of. I didn't respond. I just sat there with my hands resting on the edge of the table, calm, steady, almost too calm for what they expected. While Olivia leaned back in her chair with that satisfied smile she always wore when she felt superior, the kind of smile that used to mean something to me before it started feeling like distance instead of warmth. Ethan flips burgers at a franchise stop. She continued casually, swirling her glass of iced tea like she was discussing someone else's life. It's cute, honestly, like he's still figuring things out at 35, and the laughter around her grew louder. One of her co-workers even shaking his head like he felt sorry for me. But I didn't correct her. I didn't defend myself. I just listened, because people always talk more when they think you're powerless, and Olivia had built a whole version of me in her mind that made her feel comfortable, useful, even elevated. What she didn't notice was how often the manager of that same franchise location called me personally, or how the regional reports always landed on my desk before anyone else's, or how the staff shifted their tone slightly whenever I walked in. Not fear, not awe, just a quiet respect that didn't match the story Olivia told her friends. Earlier that day, I had spent the morning doing exactly what she thought defined my entire life. I wore the same simple uniform. I greeted customers, I checked schedules, I fixed a small issue in the ordering system that would have delayed the lunch rush. All while Olivia assumed I was just another employee trying to make it through the day. She never asked questions anymore. She never cared to. And maybe that was the most dangerous part, because ignorance builds its own kind of certainty, and certainty turns into arrogance when it's left unchecked. I remember standing behind the counter that morning watching a delivery truck pull in, the driver nodding at me like I was someone important without knowing why. And I remember thinking how strange it was that people can look directly at the truth and still not recognize it when it doesn't match their expectations. Later that evening, when Olivia invited her friends over to our place, I already knew what version of me she was going to present. It was always the same script: the struggling husband, the simple job, the lack of ambition she liked to highlight like a flaw she had discovered first. She thought it made her sound like someone who settled temporarily instead of someone who misunderstood permanently. And as I sat there listening to her explain my life to people who didn't care enough to question it, I felt something settle in me. Not anger, not frustration, just clarity. Because there's a moment in every situation like this where you realize you're no longer part of the story being told about. You're just the subject of it. And that distance changes everything. Olivia reached over and touched my arm briefly, almost performative, as she added, "Don't get me wrong. He's a good guy, just not exactly ambitious." And that's when her friend Jenna laughed softly and asked, "Doesn't it ever bother you?" And Olivia shrugged without even looking at me. "You get used to it," she said. And in that second, I understood something simple and irreversible. She didn't just misunderstand me. She had decided I was small because it made her world easier to explain, and that meant anything I said would never matter more than the story she preferred. So I stayed quiet. I nodded once like I always did, and I let them continue believing exactly what they wanted, because the truth doesn't need to be loud when it already owns every door they don't know exists. After everyone finished laughing, I noticed something that most of them missed, not because it was hidden, but because they were never looking in the first place. Olivia was still talking about my job like it was a running joke she had perfected over time, her voice light, confident, almost rehearsed, as if repeating a story she had told so many times it had become part of her identity too. I stayed quiet, slowly moving my glass on the table, watching reflections of the ceiling light fracture across the surface, and I realized something simple. People do not question the version of reality that benefits them the most. Later that night, after her friends left, Olivia remained in a good mood, scrolling through her phone on the couch while I stood in the kitchen pretending to wash dishes that were already clean. She called out, casually, asking if I could pick up groceries the next day after work, her tone suggesting it was obvious where I would be and what I would be doing. I said yes without hesitation, the same way I always did, because arguing was never the point anymore. Somewhere along the way, our conversations stopped being discussions and became instructions. The kind you follow when you are no longer seen as an equal, but as a predictable extension of someone else's life. The next morning, I arrived at the franchise location at 6:45 in the morning, before the first rush, before the lights fully settled into that artificial brightness that makes everything look slightly too clean. Mark Reynolds, the store manager, was already there, and as usual he nodded at me with a level of respect that Olivia would never believe existed. "Morning, Ethan," he said, and then immediately lowered his voice. "Regional check-in call moved to today at noon. They want you on it." I simply nodded, adjusting my name badge like it meant nothing, because to everyone here I was supposed to be just another employee, but somehow I was always included in conversations that employees were never part of. I walked the floor, checked inventory logs, reviewed staffing charts, and noticed small inefficiencies that most people would ignore, not because I needed to prove anything, but because systems always reveal the truth about how much control someone actually has. By late morning, I was in the small office, behind the counter reviewing digital reports when my phone lit up with a message from Olivia. She sent a picture of her coffee with the caption joking about how hard her day was going to be compared to mine, followed by a laughing emoji. I looked at it for a moment without replying, not because I was offended, but because she genuinely believed that what she saw was all that existed. At exactly 11:58, Mark knocked on the office door and stepped in slightly uneasy. "They are connecting you now," he said, and I closed the laptop, stood up, and walked into the back conference room where the regional screen was already active. Multiple faces appeared on the video call: executives, supervisors, analysts, people who did not speak unless something mattered. And as soon as I joined, there was a subtle shift in tone, not dramatic, not obvious, but enough for someone paying attention to notice. Olivia had no idea that this room existed in my world, no idea that the franchise she joked about was part of a network I had quietly structured over years of decisions she never asked about. The meeting began with standard reports, performance metrics, quarterly updates, and then Mark glanced at me. Before speaking carefully, "We have a situation in the Southern District that requires clarification from ownership." And in that moment, I felt the same stillness I always felt right before truth stopped being theoretical and became unavoidable. I leaned slightly forward, placed my hands together, and simply said I was ready. There was no drama in my voice, no need for it, because power rarely introduces itself loudly when it already controls the room quietly. Across town, Olivia was likely still planning her evening, still assuming I would come home tired, still convinced she understood exactly who she was married to. But in this room, surrounded by systems and people who actually knew the structure beneath the surface, I was no longer the version of myself she laughed about. I was the variable she had never accounted for. And that was the first moment when everything started to shift in a direction she would not recognize until it was already too late. The silence after my answer on the regional call was not empty. It was measured, like a room waiting to see which way gravity would settle, and I stayed still in my chair, listening as the first analyst continued speaking about performance numbers, while my mind was already moving ahead of the conversation. Because once you reach a certain level inside a system, you stop reacting to information and start anticipating how it will be used. Mark Reynolds kept his eyes slightly lowered, not out of fear, but out of habit, the habit of people who understand hierarchy without needing it explained. And when the regional director finally addressed me directly, his tone was careful, almost respectful in a way that would have confused anyone who thought I was just an employee. "Ethan, can you confirm the restructuring alignment for the Southern District?" he asked, and I paused for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, not for effect, but because I was deciding how much of the truth needed to be spoken at that moment. Olivia, somewhere across the city, was likely still living inside a version of reality where I was predictable, where I was background noise to her ambitions and her conversations. But here, in this quiet conference room filled with executives who measured outcomes in millions of dollars and thousands of hours of labor, I was something else entirely. I leaned slightly forward and confirmed the alignment, my voice steady, calm, unremarkable on the surface, yet every word I spoke adjusted the direction of decisions being made in real time. The call continued, but the energy had shifted, subtle but irreversible, like a compass realizing north had been misread and correcting itself. Without announcement, when the meeting ended, Mark exhaled slowly and looked at me with something between caution and familiarity. "Everything is on schedule," he said, and I simply nodded, closing the laptop as if nothing significant had occurred, because the most powerful movements are often the ones that do not announce themselves. I left the office and walked through the franchise floor just as the lunch rush was beginning to build. Customers forming small lines, employees moving with rehearsed urgency, and none of them knowing that the structure guiding their work had just been quietly reinforced at a level they would never see. Olivia texted me twice during that time, first asking if I could stop by the store later to pick up something for dinner, then sending a follow-up message complaining about traffic near her office. Her world remained completely detached from mine, not because I hid it from her intentionally in that moment, but because she had never once been curious enough to look beyond what she assumed. At one point, I stood near the counter observing a small issue with the ordering system again. The same type of issue I had already corrected before, and I watched a new employee struggle with it. Not because he was incapable, but because he had never been shown the deeper structure behind the tool he was using. And that thought lingered with me longer than expected, because people rarely fail due to lack of ability. They fail because they are never given access to the system that explains the ability itself. Later that afternoon, I received a call from Daniel Brooks, the regional executive whose presence alone usually meant decisions were being finalized, rather than discussed. His voice was direct but not harsh. "We need you to review the full franchise ownership consolidation report before end of week," he said, and I acknowledged it without hesitation, as if it were routine, because to me it was, but to anyone outside this structure, it would have sounded like something far more significant than it appeared. After the call ended, I stood for a moment in the small storage corridor behind the store, listening to the muffled sounds of daily operations continuing as if nothing beneath them had shifted, and I thought about Olivia again, about how easily she reduced everything she did not understand into something small enough to dismiss, not realizing that ignorance does not protect you from reality. It only delays the moment you have to face it. And as I stepped back onto the floor, watching employees move through their shifts unaware of the architecture above them, I understood something simple and final. The story she believed about my life was still intact for now, but it was no longer aligned with the system that actually governed it. And those two things were now on a collision path that neither of us had fully seen yet. The next morning began like any other ordinary day on the surface, with the same predictable rhythm that most people never question. But underneath that normality, there was a structure shifting in ways that no one around me could see. I arrived at the franchise location at 6:50 in the morning, the parking lot still half empty, the air slightly cool in that early hour that makes everything feel temporarily paused. Inside the store, the lights were already on, humming softly above the polished counters, and Mark Reynolds was again the first person I saw, standing near the back office with a tablet in his hand. He looked up as I entered and gave a brief nod, not formal, not nervous, just aligned, as if he already understood that something had changed even if nothing visible had. "Morning, Ethan," he said, and I responded the same way I always did, calm, measured, indistinguishable from any other day. But today there was a quiet weight behind every routine action. I checked the system logs, reviewed the overnight sales data, and adjusted a minor scheduling conflict that would have caused delays during the lunch rush. Small things, repeated patterns, the kind of tasks that usually go unnoticed but collectively determine whether a system runs smoothly or begins to break down. Around 8:30, Olivia texted me again, this time a photo of her coffee cup with a short message about how exhausting her morning traffic had been, followed by a comment about how at least I probably had an easy day ahead. I stared at the message for a moment without replying, not out of anger, but because the distance between her perception and reality had started to feel almost mathematical, like two lines moving in opposite directions that had once appeared parallel only from far away. I put the phone away and continued working, because routine has a way of grounding people even when everything beneath it is shifting. By mid-morning, the store had fully activated into its normal cycle, customers coming in waves, employees moving between tasks, the sound of registers, conversations, and machines creating a steady background rhythm. And yet I noticed something subtle. The staff seemed slightly more attentive around me than usual, not because anything had been said, but because awareness spreads faster than information when people sense hierarchy without being told where it sits. Mark approached me briefly near the prep area and mentioned that the regional office had confirmed an additional review of operational ownership data later in the week. His tone was neutral, but his eyes lingered for half a second longer than necessary, as if he was trying to understand where exactly I fit inside. That conversation, I simply acknowledged it and continued walking the floor, observing everything with the same quiet focus I always maintained, but now with an added layer of awareness that every process here was not isolated. It was connected to something larger, something structured across multiple locations, multiple teams, multiple decisions that most employees would never see. Around noon, I stepped into the small office again for a scheduled internal call, this one shorter, more direct, with Daniel Brooks joining briefly to confirm data alignment across multiple franchise regions. His presence on screen was calm but precise, the kind of authority that does not need emphasis because it already exists in every sentence he speaks. He asked for confirmation on consolidation timelines, and I provided it without hesitation, my voice steady, consistent, not revealing anything beyond what was necessary. After the call ended, there was a brief silence in the room, not uncomfortable, just reflective, like the system itself was pausing before continuing its next cycle. I leaned back slightly in the chair and reviewed the updated dashboard metrics on the screen, watching how small adjustments in ownership structure created ripple effects across scheduling, supply chain coordination, and staffing allocations, none of it dramatic in isolation. But together it formed a network that most people only experience from the inside, without ever understanding its shape. Olivia called again during my break, this time more casual, asking if I was free later that evening, mentioning that she might meet some friends, and suggesting I could join if I finished early. Her tone carried the same underlying assumption it always had, that my day was flexible, simple, contained within a narrow frame she believed she understood completely. I told her I would see what I could do, the same answer I always gave when I did not want to explain complexity to someone who had already decided simplicity was the truth. After the call, I stood outside the back entrance of the store for a moment, looking out at the street where everything appeared normal, cars passing, people walking, sunlight reflecting off glass windows, and I thought about how easily entire systems remain invisible to the people who depend on them, not because they are hidden, but because most people never think to look beyond what directly affects them. I returned inside, finished the remaining reports, and prepared for the afternoon cycle, knowing that by the end of the week, the distance between what Olivia believed and what actually existed would no longer be sustainable, not because anything sudden would happen, but because reality does not adjust itself to perception. It waits until perception runs out of room to exist. By the time the afternoon rush began, the store had already settled into its predictable rhythm, customers entering in steady intervals, employees rotating between stations, and the sound of commerce creating a constant layer of background noise that most people never truly listen to. I moved through it all with the same controlled awareness I had maintained throughout the week, not reacting, not forcing anything, simply observing how every part of the system responded to small changes in demand and structure. Mark Reynolds approached me near the beverage station and mentioned that a minor supplier delay had been resolved without escalation, and I acknowledged it with a simple nod, because efficiency rarely needs acknowledgement when it is functioning correctly. Around 3 in the afternoon, Olivia sent another message, this time more detailed, saying she had booked dinner reservations for Friday at a place she had wanted to try and assumed I would be available. She added a small comment about how I should probably take a break from work for once, and I read it without replying immediately, not because I was avoiding her, but because the phrase itself revealed how little she understood about the structure of my time. To her, work and life were separate categories, but to me they were layers of the same system, interconnected and continuously active. I placed the phone face down and continued reviewing operational reports on the tablet provided by the regional office, noting how performance metrics across multiple locations were aligning in a way that suggested a larger consolidation process nearing completion, not abrupt, not disruptive, but precise and intentional, like a system gradually revealing its final configuration after years of preparation. Later that afternoon, Daniel Brooks joined a short follow-up call, his tone efficient but slightly more focused than before. He confirmed that final authorization for the regional restructuring would be scheduled within the next operational cycle. And as he spoke, I could hear the careful precision in his language, the kind used when decisions are already made but still require formal acknowledgement. I confirmed my availability and readiness without hesitation, because at this point there was nothing left to decide, only timing. After the call ended, I remained seated for a moment in the small office behind the store, listening to the muffled sounds of the franchise continuing its normal operations outside the door. The register beeping, employees speaking to customers, the rhythm of daily commerce continuing as if nothing significant was approaching, and I thought again about Olivia, about how she measured life in visible outcomes, in job titles, in social impressions, in immediate comparisons that made sense within a narrow frame. She believed she understood stability because she could see my day-to-day routine. But she had never once considered that routine itself can be a cover for structure far larger than what is visible at the surface. When I finally stepped back onto the floor, the lighting had shifted slightly as late afternoon sun filtered through the front windows, casting long reflections across the polished surfaces. I walked the aisles slowly, checking end cap displays, observing inventory flow, noting how employees adjusted naturally to customer density without realizing they were responding to systems designed far above their awareness. Mark passed by and briefly mentioned that corporate compliance checks were now fully synchronized across regions, his tone calm, but his expression suggested he understood the significance even if he did not speak it aloud. I simply replied that everything was proceeding as expected, because at this point expectation was no longer speculation, it was alignment. Olivia called once more just before closing time, asking if I would be home for dinner and mentioning she had invited a friend over who might stop by later in the evening. Her voice carried the same casual certainty it always did, as if my schedule was a fixed variable she could safely assume. I told her I would be home when I could. The same neutral answer that required no explanation and created no conflict. And after the call ended, I stood near the back exit of the store for a moment, looking out at the parking lot as the sun began to lower, and I realized that the distance between what she believed and what was actually in motion was no longer growing. It was already fully formed. The only thing left was for it to become visible the evening before the scheduled regional authorization cycle began. The atmosphere inside the franchise location felt unchanged on the surface, yet every layer beneath it carried a different kind of weight, like a system running the same visible program while quietly updating its core structure. I arrived slightly earlier than usual, not because I needed to, but because timing had begun to matter in a more precise way. Mark Reynolds was already present, standing near the back office with a tablet as always, but his posture was more focused than before, less routine, more attentive. He greeted me with a simple nod and said nothing unnecessary, which in itself communicated more than words. I checked the operational dashboard again, reviewing the final alignment of franchise data across regions, and noticed that every metric now reflected a synchronized structure, as if individual locations had stopped behaving like separate units and started acting as parts of a single coordinated system. Olivia texted me just before opening hours, asking what time I would be home and adding that her friend Jenna might stop by again. She included a small comment about how I had been working too much lately, and I read it without responding, not because I was ignoring her, but because explaining complexity to someone who had already decided the shape of your life is often pointless. By mid-morning, the store had entered its normal operational rhythm, customers moving in predictable waves, employees responding with practiced efficiency, and every action reinforcing the illusion that nothing beyond this moment mattered. But I was no longer inside that illusion. I was watching it from a structural level that most people never think to consider. Around 11:30, Daniel Brooks called directly, his tone more final than before. He informed me that the regional consolidation approval had been fully processed and would be formally recognized within the next operational meeting window. There was no dramatic emphasis in his voice, only confirmation, like reading the final line of a report that had already been completed elsewhere. I acknowledged the update and ended the call, then sat in the small office behind the store for a moment longer than usual, listening to the sound of the business continuing outside the door, the rhythm of transactions, conversations, and movement that represented a world unaware of the structural shift that had just finalized above it. I thought briefly about Olivia, about how she would interpret the coming days using the only framework she had ever used: visible status, visible roles, visible assumptions about capability. She had always believed that what she saw was all that existed, and that belief had allowed her to remain confident even when she was completely misaligned with reality. I stood up and walked onto the floor as the lunch cycle began to build, observing how employees moved with natural coordination, not knowing that the system guiding their work had just entered its final configuration stage. Mark approached briefly and mentioned that compliance verification across all franchise tiers was now complete, his tone careful, almost neutral, but his eyes held the awareness of someone who understood that structural decisions were no longer theoretical, they were active. I simply responded that everything was proceeding as expected, because at this point expectation was no longer prediction, it was confirmation. Olivia called again during the afternoon, this time sounding slightly more distracted, mentioning dinner plans and asking if I could pick up something on my way home. She also asked if I had heard anything interesting at work, a question she asked casually, not realizing that what she considered interesting and what was actually occurring belonged to completely different categories of reality. I told her the day had been normal, and she accepted that answer immediately, because it matched the story she had already built. Later in the day, I walked through the store during a quieter period, observing inventory flow, staffing balance, and system efficiency, each element now functioning as part of a larger synchronized network that extended far beyond this single location. And I realized that what most people call stability is often just a lack of visibility in a change already in progress. As closing time approached, the lighting inside the store softened and the pace slowed, customers thinning out, employees transitioning into end-of-shift routines, and I remained for a few minutes after most had left, standing near the front entrance looking out at the parking lot, where everything appeared unchanged: cars, lights, movement, normal life continuing without interruption. But internally the structure had already completed its transition, and the only thing left was for the people inside it to realize that the version of reality they had been relying on no longer matched the system that was actually in control. The notification came just after closing time, when the store had finally settled into that quiet after-hours atmosphere where everything feels temporarily suspended between what was completed and what comes next. I was in the back office reviewing the final end-of-day reports when Mark Reynolds knocked once and stepped in without urgency, holding his tablet slightly lower than usual, not because of hesitation, but because of awareness. "It is happening," he said simply, and I understood immediately what he meant without needing clarification. The regional authorization cycle had moved from preparation into execution. I closed the report I was reviewing and stood up, not reacting emotionally, because there was no reason to. Everything had already been set in motion long before this moment. Across town, Olivia was likely finishing her evening routine, completely unaware that the structure she had never seen was now fully transitioning into its finalized configuration. I walked to the front of the store one last time, observing the empty aisles, the still counters, and the quiet hum of machines shutting down non-essential systems. It looked ordinary from the outside, unchanged, predictable, but I knew that perception only applied to those who were not connected to what was actually occurring beneath the surface. My phone vibrated once, a message from Olivia asking if I was on my way home, followed by a second message reminding me to pick up something small from a nearby store. I did not respond immediately, not because I was delaying, but because I was aware that every message she sent now belonged to a version of reality that was about to lose its stability. I placed the phone back in my pocket and stepped outside. The evening air was cooler than earlier in the day, and the parking lot was nearly empty except for a few scattered cars reflecting the overhead lights. Mark followed a few steps behind and stopped near the entrance, his voice low but steady. "Corporate confirmation has been distributed across all regional channels," he said, and I nodded once, acknowledging the completion of a process that had taken months to align. There was no need for further explanation, because everything that needed to be understood had already been embedded in the system long before words were spoken. I stood there for a moment longer, looking out at the surrounding area, the streetlights, the distant traffic, the quiet movement of a world that continued operating under assumptions that had already shifted. And I thought about how often people confuse continuity with control, when in reality continuity is simply the delay between structural change and personal recognition. Olivia's perception of my life was still intact in her mind, still built on visible routines and assumptions she had never questioned. But that perception no longer matched the underlying framework that had just been finalized, and the gap between those two realities was no longer theoretical. It was now operational. I started walking toward my car, the sound of my steps echoing lightly in the empty space. And as I opened the door, I received another message from Olivia, this one shorter, asking if everything was okay. A question that came too late to prevent understanding and too early for her to comprehend the answer. I looked at the screen for a moment without responding, then placed the phone down, because at that point communication was no longer about clarification, it was about timing, and timing had already moved beyond where she believed we still were. The message arrived while I was still sitting in my car outside the franchise location, the engine off, the interior lights faintly reflecting on the dashboard, Olivia's name appearing on the screen again, this time followed by a single sentence asking where I was and why I was not responding. There was no panic in her tone, only mild confusion, the kind that appears when a familiar pattern stops behaving as expected. I stared at the message for a few seconds without replying, not out of avoidance, but because I was observing something more important than the words themselves. I was observing the gap forming between expectation and reality. Across the street, the franchise building stood quiet, lights dimming in sections as closing procedures completed their final cycle, everything appearing normal to anyone passing by, yet nothing about the internal structure was the same as it had been even a day earlier. I started the car and drove without urgency, maintaining the same speed, the same route, the same outward routine that would not raise questions, because disruption is rarely visible at the moment it becomes real. It is only recognized afterward, when systems stop behaving the way people assumed they would. Olivia called twice during the drive. I did not answer either time, not because I was avoiding her, but because I was no longer operating inside the version of time she believed we still shared. When I finally arrived home, the house looked exactly as it always did, warm lights in the windows, a quiet street, a sense of normality that would have reassured anyone who did not know what was already in motion beneath the surface. I stepped inside and placed my keys on the counter, hearing Olivia's voice before I fully entered the room. She was sitting on the couch with her phone in hand, her expression slightly different from usual, not angry, not emotional, but alert, like she was trying to recalibrate something she could not yet define. She looked up at me and asked where I had been, her tone controlled but carrying a subtle edge of uncertainty. I told her I was working late, the same answer I had given many times before, but this time it landed differently, not because the words had changed, but because the context around them had. She studied my face for a moment longer than usual, as if searching for something that used to be predictable but was no longer guaranteed. She mentioned dinner was already cold and that she had tried calling earlier. I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without engaging the tension inside it, because explaining would not have changed anything at that point. The structure of understanding between us had already shifted too far for casual conversation to bridge it. I walked past her into the kitchen and poured a glass of water, listening to the silence that followed, not uncomfortable, but unfamiliar, like a room adjusting to a presence it had not yet fully recognized. Olivia followed slowly and leaned against the counter, asking again if everything was all right at work, and this time her question carried something closer to concern, though still filtered through her own limited framework of what she believed my work to be. I looked at her for a moment, not with distance, but with clarity, because for the first time she was asking a question that no longer had a simple answer. Everything had been in motion long before this evening, long before this conversation, and what she was sensing now was not change happening, but change already completed. I told her that everything was fine, and she seemed to accept it, not because she believed it fully, but because she did not yet have an alternative explanation to replace it with. Later that night, I stood by the window looking out at the quiet street, the same street I had looked at countless times before, but now it felt different, not because it had changed, but because I had, and I understood something simple and final in that moment, that most people never notice when the structure around them has already shifted. They only notice when the version of stability they were relying on stops responding the way it used to, and by then, The system has already moved beyond their ability to adjust to it the next morning did not feel different at first glance, because most turning points in life do not announce themselves with visible changes. They simply exist and wait for perception to catch up. I woke up earlier than usual, moved through the house in silence, and prepared coffee while Olivia remained upstairs still half asleep, unaware that the structure surrounding our lives had already completed its final adjustment. I checked my phone once before leaving and saw a message from Daniel Brooks confirming that the full franchise ownership consolidation had been formally registered and distributed across all operational systems. There was no celebration in the message, no emphasis, only confirmation, like a final line being placed at the end of a document that had already been understood in advance. I read it once, then placed the phone down, because at that point confirmation no longer changed anything. It only finalized awareness. When I arrived at the franchise location later that morning, everything appeared exactly the same as always. Employees moving through their routines, customers entering and leaving, the steady rhythm of commerce continuing without interruption. But there was a difference that only people inside the structure could sense. Conversations were quieter, eye contact lasted slightly longer, and the usual assumptions about hierarchy no longer carried the same certainty. Mark Reynolds met me near the entrance and handed me a sealed envelope without speaking, his expression neutral but intentional. I already knew what it contained before opening it, but I still did, because formality sometimes matters more than surprise. Inside was the official confirmation of ownership transfer across the regional network, structured, signed, and distributed to all relevant operational channels. I placed it back into the envelope and walked through the store as I always had, observing everything without interruption. But now every system I looked at was no longer something I was part of. It was something that belonged to me in a way that required no explanation. By midday, Daniel Brooks called again, this time asking if I could attend a short verification meeting with senior regional staff. I agreed, without hesitation, because there was no longer anything to prepare, only alignment to acknowledge. Across the city, Olivia was likely beginning her day as usual, unaware that the foundation she had always assumed was static had already been redefined, and that her understanding of my life was about to reach its limit. I arrived at the meeting location just before noon, a quiet corporate space filled with executives who spoke in controlled language and measured decisions, the kind of room where outcomes are confirmed rather than debated. When I entered, the atmosphere shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough to signal recognition. People who had never acknowledged my role directly were now aware of exactly where I stood within the system. Daniel Brooks began the session by formally confirming the finalization of ownership structure across all franchise regions. And as he spoke, I noticed the subtle reactions around the room. Not shock, not confusion, but recalibration, the kind that happens when assumptions are replaced by verified information. When the meeting concluded, there was no applause, no dramatic closure, only acknowledgement, and then movement back into routine, as if the system itself had simply settled into its correct configuration. I left the building alone and drove without urgency, not because I had nowhere to go, but because there was no longer any pressure attached to direction. When I arrived home that evening, Olivia was waiting in the living room, her expression different from before, less confident, more attentive, as if she had been holding questions for some time without knowing how to form them. She stood when I entered and asked where I had been, but her voice carried less assumption than before. I told her I had been working, and for the first time she did not respond immediately. She studied me carefully, noticing something she could not yet define, not change in appearance, but change in certainty. She asked again what exactly I had been doing, and I looked at her without evasion, because at that point evasion was no longer necessary. And I understood that the distance between what she believed and what was real had finally reached its limit. I told her that the franchise system she thought I worked inside was now under my ownership, not as a metaphor, not as interpretation, but as fact, and the silence that followed was not dramatic. It was structural, like a room realizing it had been built on a different foundation than it assumed. She sat down slowly, not because she was overwhelmed in emotion, but because she was adjusting to information that no longer fit her internal model of reality. And for the first time, she did not speak immediately after hearing me, because there was nothing in her framework prepared to respond to what she had just learned. I stood near the window looking out at the same quiet street we had always shared, and I realized that nothing outside had changed. Only understanding had shifted, and that shift was enough to redefine everything that had come before it.